Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the moderator and chair of this discussion session. I am Woohyun, working for the National Information Agency. We're supposed to have just 10-minute break, but due to the technical issues, we are behind the schedule at the moment. Please understand it. Today, we're have been talking about the practices of digital literacy and also the social and political context and education. And now we are going into the discussion session. I would like to introduce 5 discussants. First, Dr. Amie Kim. She is the policy and research team leader at the Community Media Foundation. Next, Professor Hyunjin at the Ewha Women's University. His department is in elementary education, and he has been focusing on digital literacy. And then Eunjoo Chang from Department of Democracy and Citizenship at the Ministry of Education. She herself worked as a Korean language teacher, and he has been in charge of framing the policy for digital literacy. And for Hyun, he is the assistant professor at the Department of Mass Communication at the Incheon National University. Last but not least, Kwang-suk, the professor at the Department of Digital and Cultural Policy at the Seoul National University of Science and Technology. And he is also active critic in art and research and activism and so on and so forth. Well, we ask the discussants to prepare 3 questions for presentations. And one discussant will ask 3 questions altogether to different presenters, and all 5 discussants will give their 3 questions to the presenters of their choice. After the discussants' comments, each presenter will answer the questions. After that, we are going to open the floor so we can take some questions from the floor. We have only limited time, so please keep the time. In the best interest of time, the answer may not be enough to solve all the questions, but we're going to also have some other spaces in a journal, so other answers will be reflected on a journal in an article. Now, Amie Kim.
As introduced, I'm Amie. And thank you very much for all the presenters for making the excellent presentation. And I would like to thank the Gyeongin National University of Education for hosting today's event together with the Incheon Community Media Center. And I would like to also thank the Professor Hyeon-Seon. And I only have 6 minutes, so I will try to be really brief and ask the question I really wanted to ask. And I have a question to Professor Lisa Kervin and Professor Shin and to Professor Lucy Pangrazio. The professor Yes, we've been talking about the literacy, the media literacy is really important, and how we will expand the education is really important, but we were not able to put that into practice and how it is being realized in the real life. And that was really well illustrated by the Professor Lisa Kervin's presentation. I'm really focused on the media experience of children, and the culture, that experience that they have on the digital space is quite different from what we used to have. And digital devices that they use create the culture of digital experience, and we can see that. And the media infrastructure that we can also see that's really important, and the media that we use in real time and that is created by the data connection And there is also the media cooperation that plays a really important role, and how we will approach that and how we will do the research. That was really well illustrated by all the presentations. So thank you very much. And I was really impressed by how literacy was interpreted and how it was being viewed from a different perspective, and how it is viewed by the traditionally is being connected with your research, and online and offline experiences have been connected more. And as Professor Kervin mentioned in her presentation, that now children are having the interaction on through the digital experience, and also through the other presentations, that we can see that critical interpretation and critical reading and critical reflection is really important. So I have two questions for three presenters. First to Professor Lisa Kervin. So when you explain the digital literacy, that you did not use the verb use, but instead you use the verb consume, that I would like to know why you use that word. So as a consumers, that the children use and children consume the digital media. And do you think that consumption and consume was the more relevant in the children's the consumption of the media? So that's why you use the word consume. And you also use the activity theory to explain. And within the activity theory, how do you view the community and what is the scope of community? When we look at online and offline community, is it really confined to the offline community, which means the families, parents, and the siblings, or does that include the digital community members as well? And secondly, I have the question to Professor Shin. I have a lot of questions for your presentation. When we do the media education, yes, we need to have a good understanding of the media infrastructure as well. I absolutely agree with what you said in your presentation. And media ecology and media infrastructure, how it is being different, was briefly mentioned in your presentation. But due to the time constraints, you may not be able to explain in detail. But what is the difference between media ecology and media infrastructure? And in the civic society, I'm working with the community media center. So workshop you led was quite impressive. The co-ops and the ICT, the media, the workers and the local residents, they have a different interest and understanding of media. So what are the things that we have to take into account when you're doing the workshop for the many different types of people? And this question is also relevant to Lucy Pangraggio's presentation. You also mentioned about the alternative, the media infrastructure. Do you think the imagining itself is okay? Or it will be even better if we can do some kind of project that will really realize that what we have imagined in the project. So if we can do the project that can realize that what the people imagine, that will be better. And Professor Lucy Pangraggio said that we have to relate the data with the real lives, and we have to think creatively, and we have to come up with the alternative, and that was quite impressive. So that workshop, if we apply that to the school education, teachers' role, and so how should we support the teachers? So what kind of support should be provided to the teachers in terms of the personal data and privacy of adolescents and students? So after the students do the workshop, what are the impact that they felt? So the data safety and the privacy of youth was also mentioned. And the student who experienced the workshop, Is there any impact on their perception and the behaviors of youth after the workshop? I have a lot of more questions, but I have limited time, so that's all the questions that I would like to make to three presenters.
예, 이어서 질문 드리겠습니다. 저는 이화여대에 공부하고 있는 옥현진입니다.
And I'm Hyunjin, the professor at the Ewha Women's University. This is not really easy to have this topic on one topic of this kind at one conference. So I have questions to Professor Carvin, Professor Byung-Chul, and Chang. I have two questions for Carvin. Well, the first question is about how much and how parents are involved in digital and media literacy education in general. The development of literacy started from the birth of a child, even before the public education. So the literacy education takes place from home. And digital and media literacy education, I mean, the same applies to digital and media literacy, I would say. In case of oral literacy or print literacy, parents educate their children in a way they were educated from their children and from schools. But for digital media literacy, parents may not have such experiences. Because of that, perhaps parents may feel burdened or are hesitant to educate their children about digital and media literacy. And in case of Australia, how can you overcome this issue? Is there any certain digital and media literacy education programs for parents? And at the same time, in case the project that you presented, how did you interact with parents? And the second question is quite abstract, or it's more about a big picture. In relation to digital media literacy, Australian public education system is quite leading the rest of the world. What would be the background of, social and cultural background, which can be a motivation for the digital and media literacy? Well, the public education is taking place in a limited time and space and materials and resources. So sometimes what should be a priority in education is controversial. For example, which is more important, oral literacy, print literacy, or digital and media literacy? Compared to other countries, though, Australia took digital and media literacy-related education is something very important, and it is reflected in public education. So I'm wondering about the social, economic, political, and historic background of Australia that has been driven such education in the public education system. And the second question should go to Professor Yeonju. The first question is about the major principle that can systemize the education of critical literacy. In your presentation, the subject of the project is 8th grader, which is equivalent to the 2nd grader of middle school in South Korea. I guess that the literacy education should be repeated and deepened throughout the public education curriculum. That means such critical literacy education should differ, and in terms of curriculum, depending on the graders. For example, the 8th graders may have different curricula from the curriculum that are used, the curricula that are used for 4th graders or 10th graders. So what would be the major principles of that can differentiate the content of curricula for different students, different graders? And I guess that the case that you introduced in the presentation was thought to be useful for 8th graders, and why? What's the evidence, and also in addition, what's the major principles for CCSs? And the second question is about the language practices and the role of teachers in the classroom cases when they do critical literacy education. The critical literacy education should be timely and also maybe very sensitive, too sensitive to be discussed from the level of teachers, particularly when the students are higher graders. I mean, they are like later teenagers. So some teachers feel really burdened to discuss such sensitive issues with the students. From the perspective of critical literacy education, how can such issues be handled? And if you have any ideas about teaching principles to overcome such issues, please let us know. And third, what would be the most optimal classroom environment for such critical literacy education? And last but not least, I would like to ask the question to Professor Chang. Person-to-person communication should be successful, and to that end, what would be needed in education planning? Well, the Gyeongin National University of Education may have such aspirations. And Professor Oh, if you what kind of programs do you have for your students at the Gyeongin University of Education, Gyeongin National University of Education, so that your students will touch the younger children in a way that you planned?
Next, I would like to invite Dr. Chang to make the presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the third discussant. I'm Chang Eunjoo. I have a question for Professor Lisa Kervin, Professor Cho Byung-young, and Professor Oh. Firstly, I would like to make the discussion for Professor Lisa Kervin's presentation. The digital literacy education at home is ever more emphasized because of the increasing number of distance classes being carried out. So you explained that digital literacy activity at home based on the activity theory, which is quite impressive. So interacting with the others is really important. That you also mentioned that the certain rules and the family environment as a community and this division of roles of each individual is also important. And that these are all interesting elements to explain digital literacy. So in your presentation, you also mentioned about the division of labor. So can you elaborate more on this? I wonder if each individual communicates at the same level of literacy or whether there were some differences in the roles division depending on their level of literacy. And if there are some differences, what specific roles can be made based on the level of literacy? So there might be the roles for the guardians and parents and roles given to the children and how they interact and what kind of roles are given to each member. So that's my first question. And the second question is related with the circumstance that we have in Korea. The distance learning is being carried out at the moment because of the COVID-19, and there are the mismatch of expectations. For example, the schools give the assignment to students using social media, but at some home, the parents do not want their children to use the social media. So there's the mismatch in the expectations and the rules given for the media use. So when this mismatch takes place between school and parents and between the community and parents, how should we address such conflicts? And second question is for Professor Jo Byung-young. I have some comments and questions. So presenting a context for understanding students' literacy from various angles, that was quite impressive and inspirational. And Professor Cho, you presented the various perspectives. And in particular, the examples of critical reading activities were mentioned based on the historical events in which social conflicts were revealed. So through such activities, students were able to form their identity and value. And these class activities I believe, are of great significance in terms of democratic citizenship education. Recently, we're really focusing on the democratic citizenship education. So if we are doing that, there are some controversial issues. So there is a lot of difficulty in using controversial topics as the subject of class. So I have two questions in relation to that. So when you use a controversial topic for class, as mentioned briefly by the Dr. Oak, we might have a unique situation and might not. So when we discuss the controversial and the politically critical issue, that some point out that there might be the political bias and the strict standards have to be applied for the classroom discussion, and the teachers, they are involved in the self-censorship. So going through the self-censorship, teachers hesitate to discuss these political issues. But still, to increase the critical thinking skills, whether it's photos or the controversial issues in our history, then these have to be discussed in class. So what kind of things that we have to pay attention when we select these topics and materials for class? And second question, you mentioned the case of the students, the Hyeon and Tario, and the source ABC were used. And that source were chosen by the teacher or the students by themselves. But after listening to the presentation, I can feel that the teacher chose the source and gave that source to the students. So, and then student chose out of the option given by the teachers. So what was the reason that these two students choose the source ABC? Or there were some guidelines given by the teachers that encouraged the students to choose the source ABC? And you also read the conversation between Keon and Tareo. And I feel like the reading image was a practice in your class. So there were some guidelines given in advance as well. And if guidelines were given, how did you give such guidelines? And lastly, I also have a discussion and some comments and questions for Professor Oh. The European Union announced the digital competency and DCOM. And if you look at the details, the digital content creation, communication, and collaborations are presented as sub-competencies. But linking digital competencies with cultural sensibility is unfamiliar to me. But your presentation made me to think about how such digital competencies can be materialized at the level of arts education. And the case you shared in your presentation provide an opportunity for me to interpret the meaning of the artwork. It might not be just the work in the art, it might be the literature and the works that can be created. So by inducing the active participation of the readers and the viewers, the interaction could take place, that I could see that from your presentation. So between creators and the readers and viewers, the interaction can take place, even if it is not a digital creation. But since it's a digital, methods and opportunity for interaction have been further expanded. But in terms of the popularization and generalization and universalization of the art, it's questionable whether digital art has a higher or lower barrier to entry than other arts area. Yes, the viewers can be the active audience, but I thought that it might be difficult for them to become the prosumers. So I was wondering, can I actually try that in the elementary and middle school, elementary and secondary education? The students can create some work and to become the prosumers. It's somewhat unfamiliar to us. So can digital art be applied to the creative activities in elementary, secondary education? And if possible, how can we do that? Yeah, what you have suggested was quite impressive. In elementary and middle schools, if we can apply that and how we can do that. So what I mean by how we can do that is that how we can develop the rubrics and how we can develop the unit instructions and the guidelines and how we can lead the students. And second question is that yes, the collaboration is really highlighted and the collaboration with the community is also being highlighted as well. And in your presentation that we can see that you cooperated with the Incheon Community Media Center. So throughout the collaboration process, were there any difficulties that you encounter that please share with us if you had cases, and what are the elements needed to improve such and address such difficulties?
Good afternoon.
인천대학교 신문방송학과의
I am
우현 교수라고 합니다.
Woohyun, professor at Incheon National University.
이지코시 신 교수님도 본인이 이제 미디어 학자라고 말씀을 해주셔서
Well, Professor Michikoshi also said that he himself is a media scholar, the scholar in media.
오늘 발표해 주신
Well,
선생님들
personally,
전문가들과 비교하면 정말
compared to others here in this conference, I'm not really an expert in media literacy. But also on the other hand, maybe I can give you some comments from the public view, general view. And also as a scholar, I also can give another view, the view that you may not hear you may not see from as the digital literacy scholars. So I'm a scholar, but I'm not an expert in digital literacy. Well, I was given to provide questions to 4 presenters, and in the best interest of time, I'm going to give just one question to one each presenter. First, I have my questions go to Professor Cho Byung-young. He actually shared with us the real case studies, and a plethora of information has been seen on the internet, and how we can get and gain the proper internet in a proper way was the question from the case study I thought. And in relation to platform and the type of data, he actually shared his ideas with us, but health literacy or health information literacy are my personal interests. So health information, economic information, and information by different subject may be also interesting to be discussed. So is this also being discussed in the digital literacy education field or community? And second, my questions go to Professor Michikoshi.
그 발표에서는 많은 부분을 말씀을 안 해주셨는데 슬라이드를
Well,
보면서 제가 느꼈던 것 중에
he didn't really mention this, but I saw this in I saw the importance of collaboration in his presentation material itself.
기술과 관련된
Well, the
기업이라든지
education organizations, technology-related companies, and civil society
부분에 대해서 이야기가
have
있어서
been working on collaborations among one another. So we can expand this kind of concept. So we can think of the point of collaboration at the global level or within a country. Maybe we can extend this idea and this network to the globe and maybe perhaps in the region of East Asia. Have you ever thought of these possibilities of collaboration at the regional or global level? Third, my question should go to Dr. Lucy Peng-Brazil.
일단은 저도 약간 비슷한 연구를 해봤는데
I myself have this kind of
학생들 대상으로
study before. I developed applications for students, and that the application was related to health information, and students collected data from it, and I myself actually collected the data from the chat windows of the students. And what I felt difficult is that my students used the applications for the purposes that I didn't really intend to achieve. For example, the chat bot actually chat window was used for their communication rather than to seek a sort of health information. So it was quite interesting though.
저는 일단 이 연구를 보면서
looking at this study,
아무래도 이제 온라인상에서 디지털 정보에 대한
digital information in the virtual space have been given some concerns to the public. So education organizations and society and others
디지털 데이터화에 대해서
have been
부정적인 시각을 만드는 것이 아닌가. 결과적으로
providing a sort of negative perspective.
한국의 경우에는 디지털 범죄와 관련해서
For example, digital and cyber criminals have been also hot topic in South Korea. So many have negative perspective about using digital tools in South Korea. But if the perspective is too negative and keeps being negative, then the pros of this the online activities or digital literacy may fade away, may be hidden by the cons of the digital literacy. I mean, digital activities. Well, in Korea, the people with disabilities or senior citizens may need digital literacy, I think, not just the younger generations. So what do you think about this? What do you think about the education for vulnerable group of people? And fourth, my last question should go to Professor Chang. Based on my personal experiences, well, for digital art, this is not a constant education, rather it's like a one-off education program. But if you develop a sort of curriculum, that can last for quite long for art, well, production, installation, and creation requires space and budget. So what kind of limitations do you see in a constant art education, digital art education in reality?
Lastly, I would like to invite Professor Lee to make a discussion. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Kwang-suk. Yeah, I've been waiting for my turn. Yeah, I will be really brief. Yeah, Professor Seon looks like she's stressed out because of the time that she has to keep. So I will be really brief. What I have prepared is quite long, but after listening to the presentations and the discussions of the other discussions, that I felt a lot and I was able to review and examine. And so thank you for all the presentations and discussions. So I have three presenters that I would like to ask a question. Professor Shin Miskosi and Professor Lucy Pangresio and Professor Oh Chang-in. But after listening to the different discussions presentation, I'm studying the media. But yes, what I learned today is that, so in this contemporary world, what will be the ideal direction that we should be headed? So someone mentioned about the prosumers. So the subject who create the text and who participate and enjoy and take pleasure in interacting with the context and the digital media, but we need something that goes beyond that. So that's why when we talk about critical literacy, that we're using that term without the common definition. But all the presentations and discussions, I think we have a common understanding of digital literacy. So three presenters, the critical literacy. So what will be the ideal look of the person who is living in this contemporary world with the well-equipped digital literacy? So I also have one question to Professor Oh. So philosophers believe that the author themselves and the artists themselves, so they can also take pleasure in creating the artworks that interact with the viewers. But your works that you have shown in the presentation, yes, that was great, as it encourages the interaction with the viewers. I believe it has a great meaning in that. But as mentioned by other discussants, yes, the taking part or interacting with the work, that's not just about the consuming. Is it the real meaning of interaction? So the users or the viewers of the artworks or the subject of education, is it the real meaning of participation or the interaction that they have with the artworks? Is it the real meaning? Does that show the real meaning of critical literacy? So the artists themselves, they can touch while creating the artworks, and they have a critical thinking and they take pleasure in that. So the viewers themselves, they go through that process and they can experience something aesthetical while interacting with the artwork. And that, I believe, is a really important basis for the critical meaning. And how do you interpret that? And I'm not sure I'm asking my question in a really clear way. So that's my question to Professor Oh. And second question is, while listening to the discussions made by other discussants, yes, the critical literacy, that we need the critical methodology for critically viewing the critical literacy. So when we have a workshop or a program on the critical literacy, that was mentioned a lot. And for the Professor Shin Mitsukoshi, yes, the platform and infrastructure was really highlighted in your presentation. And your presentation really expanded the scope to the infrastructure. But I wasn't really clear. So the technological environment and the media environment. So I guess you're trying to expand the discussion and discourse of the media landscape. So to put the critical literacy into the real world, the collaboration between the co-ops and the media entities, that can be viewed as the critical literacy. I think that's how you are viewing the critical literacy. And I'm really focused on the concept of critical making. So we use our hands and the brain to create something, right? So you also mentioned about expression and production, and I also asked a similar question to Professor Oh. So when we create something, that we do the critical thinking using our brain and interact with the technology, and we find a touch point in between that. That process itself is really important. But Professor Mitsukoshi, yes, you expanded the scope of context because you're focusing on the infrastructure and platforms algorithm. So you encourage the participant to imagine the world without Apple. The historical context can be better understood throughout your workshop. But the access is still black box. We have to look at the design details, but we cannot do that with the critical thinking. We have to do the critical making. With the advanced technology, yes, technology is quite advanced, but we cannot critically make this technology. I think I'm using the metaphorical expressions, whether it's a hardware coding or the software coding. There is an object and the media, and we use hands, our brains, and if there is no touch point between that, the critical thinking is really impossible. So Professor Shin Mitsukoshi, DIY mind and process was mentioned in your presentation. And that is quite related with the critical making that I'm really highlighted in my presentation. And my last question is to Professor Lucy Pangrazio.
You actually mentioned the radical citizenship education. You also highlighted the importance of political and economic aspects. It's very important, and I agree with you. But the subject could be workers or citizens or teenagers. It could be anyone. But what you are talking about is too general for radical literacy, I believe. It doesn't really point to any specific population or different groups. But for teenagers, well, I can't really say that they are 100% grown-ups, but they do have their own consciousness, right? So they may need a sort of guide, or we may need a sort of system or institutions to help them. Well, but SNS and the commercial companies have provided some platforms where private information is abused. But because of that, we may need a sort of system or institution or regulations to regulate it so that we can help our teenagers in the age of the floody information. So in that sense, do you have any guidelines for safe use of the internet? Or is there any specific regulations to help us to make the safe space of the internet? But well, we don't have one in Korea. But in Australia, is there any specific rules or regulations set by municipalities or the federal government? A sort of guidelines is prepared by the government? Okay, sorry for long comments.
So we have listened to the 5 different discussions. I wish we had more time to discuss more, but we have. So now we have to give only 6 minutes for the presenters to give the response. As the discussants made many different discussions, I would like to briefly summarize the question raised to each presenter. So in activity theory, the concept was asked as a question, the scope of community and how it is being actually applied. That was the question. And the audience also asked the question, in school, the digital literacy education, the mismatch between the expectations from school and family, and the question was also about the experience in Australia, how the parents reconcile their expectations from school. It will be great if we can hear the response in person from Professor Lisa Kerbin, but there was some issue with her family member, so she now had to go to Sydney. So we collected the questions and the discussions in advance and delivered to the Professor Lisa Kerbin, and we made a recording of her response. So now we will play the recorded response.
I'd like to begin by thanking the panellists who have asked such thoughtful questions about my presentation. My sincere thanks to each of them for taking time to engage so deeply with the presentation and taking the time too to ask such great questions. I've looked across the questions and I'm going to respond to a few themes. One of the questions was, and I was asked in quite detail, why I use consume rather than use when talking about digital literacy. Let me start by looking at some dictionary definitions of these words. The word use means take, hold, or deploy something to achieve something. The word consume means devour, to enjoy avidly, to engage fully, and suggests some sort of volume. To me, consume speaks to the volume of information that is available to a child in the digital context. They have to respond to written text, images, sometimes still images, sometimes moving images, sound, movement, and so on. They have to navigate quite complex pathways to make sense of the material, think about web links, knowing how to participate with a resource. This suggests to me that they're not just using technology to get a job done, to achieve something. Rather, technology is something quite absorbing and complex. Following on from another question I received, it is imperative that critical literacy is a firm part of children's digital literacies repertoires. Children need to be taught skills, competencies, and analytical tools that enable them to not only use, but to also understand, respond, and create. We want children to be active and engaged thinkers and creators in digital environments. I've also been asked a few questions about my use of activity theory. The role of community members in literacy practices is important. In my presentation, I talked about the people engaged in the activity and referred to them as the subjects, and the environment in which the activity is taking place, and I called that the community. I want to use both of these terms to talk about digital literacy practices. We can think about the subject as being the child, the parents, family members, siblings, the teacher, peers, depending, of course, on the community. We can think about community as both the physical and virtual environments. The physical environment may be the household or the classroom where the interaction occurs. The virtual environment may be the digital platform, the app, others who may be part of a virtual connection. In identifying these two aspects, the role of community and the subjects or members is critical for digital literacy learning. These people and platforms have the potential to enable or constrain literacy activities, and certainly community members may take on different roles. Who is in these physical and digital spaces matter. There are important power relationships at play. Let's connect this to the rules in activity theory, the rules and regulations governing the activity. These matter. If we think to remote learning, which many of us have just experienced, where a child at home is virtually connecting with their teacher, whose rules and regulations matter? Is it the rules in the home context where the child is physically situated? Is it the rules of the classroom as the child demonstrates their learning to their teacher through digital technologies? Who is in power, or which rules count, is very much connected to the goals and the intentions of the activity or the object. Another question I received was what happens when expectations don't match? What a school wants and what a home wants. A focus on the object, the goals and intentions of the activity is one way, I think, to explain the differences between school and home expectations for technology use. When working with families and educators, I find it useful to ask some questions like, what is the purpose of the experience? What is it that you hope to achieve? Is this important? Why? What will the benefits of this experience be for those involved? Reflecting on these questions may help shape expectations around use in terms of time, content, and other boundaries. And all this is really important, and this is the feedback that I got from the panelists, given that education systems worldwide have limited time, resources, and contextual priorities. I've been asked how much weight should be placed between traditional literacies and digital and media literacies. I think, in fact, it is no longer an either-or debate. The reality is that many children have increasing access to technology. It then becomes our responsibility as parents, as educators, and as researchers to ensure the opportunities that children have to engage with technology are quality to best build those important digital literacy and critical literacy skills I spoke about just before. I've been asked also to comment on Australia's political, economic, historical, and socio-cultural backgrounds that enable such educational decisions. And we really don't have enough time to go through all of those in great detail. But I can say in Australia, 85% of our people are internet users. In households with children under 15, 97% of those have access to the internet, with an average of 7 internet-connected devices in each household. And this data has come from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So technology is in the hands of many Australian children and young people, but we're grappling with a number of issues. Of concern to us right now is the research and resources are often lagging behind the practice, where it is that the children are up to. The exciting news for us in Australia was the announcement at the end of last year about the Australian Research Council Centre for the Digital Child. Now, this centre is led by Susan Danby at QUT in Queensland, and it's a 7-year centre, and it involves leading researchers around Australia as they focus on a vision for Australian children to be healthy, educated and connected. The research program is designed to meet Australia's ongoing challenges of supporting young children growing up in a rapidly changing digital age. For me, I'm fortunate to be able to co-lead one of the strands of research in the centre, the educated child, which enables the centre to make really strong connections with some of the work that we've started at UOW in our technology with our early start space, where we're going to establish the children's technology space and make lots of connections with our regional early start engagement centres and industry partners. I really wish I could spend more time answering more questions. I hope this is the beginning of many wonderful conversations between us all. Thank you.
답변 내용 잘 들었습니다. 많은 청중들께서 그리고 토론해 주셨던 분들께서도 사실 이 코로나 상황 때문에 아이들이 집에서 교육을 받고 있는 상황.
Also, even discussants and speakers have been thinking of how family members and household can do something for children because children are away from schools due to COVID-19 outbreak.
기술센터에서 앞으로 하게 될
Digital
그 연구들을
Child
관심 깊게
Center
궁금하셨던 것들에 대한 답변을 앞으로 찾아가실 수 있으리라 생각합니다. 다음은
will make some achievement, I believe, so we can keep an eye on it. Then we can find some more answers from the practice at the center, I believe.
다른 연령들에 따라서 어떠한
Depending on ages, we may need a different approaches in the digital literacy curriculum program. Two different subjects, right? Two different graders. And the role of teachers and students was also asked, was also one of the questions. And when we do teach in classrooms, what kind of language practices do we need? And what kind of approaches do we need to take in digital literacy education? And for critical digital literacy, rather than just teaching digital literacy to students alone, rather, we may have to provide a sort of tailored program for digital literacy to our children. Professor Cho, first. Well, seems like the webinar seminar is very serious. Well, I usually make jokes during presentations, but I couldn't because of the mood. Well, taking some questions from the audience and from the panels, let me summarize my answer because I cannot go into details of each question. But I found some overlaps among questions, actually. Well, the education system of literacy education system and principles, it's a good question, but it will consume a lot of time, so let me skip it. And also there was a question regarding the US system. There are 3 course standards, SCSS. There are 2 subjects. One is English language and art and mathematics. The other is mathematics. And the second is the C3 standard. College, career and civic life. That's about society. And the third is next generation science standard, and that is about science. Well, these 3 are interconnected rather than traditionally separated. And multi-source reading capacity are evaluated through the system. In any way, the text discourse is very important. You have to converse through text. You can express yourself and communicate with text, indeed. It's an implicit consensus rather than agreed consensus, I would say. So recently, we have seen such a tendency. And the point of the connection is from literacy in education system in the United States. And one of the most controversial issues is about the role of teachers, what's come from the audience and also panels. When we bring about a controversial issue to the classroom, up to where and up to extent can teachers speak about the issues? That's a big question. I mean, many people are talking about the question. Even in the United States, teachers are self-regulating sometimes. Well, in my case, I've seen the common tendency among 3 parties: parents, universities, and faculty. While the researcher and faculty members focused on literacy, and we were able to reflect literacy in our curriculum, But political issues, which may bring about some interest group, the conflict of the interests, may need a sort of agreement or shared ideas among different parties. But what I would like to emphasize is that without any discussions beforehand, before bringing about some political issues to the classroom, you cannot really change the current system or current mood and current tendency, current culture in school. Discourse knowledge at the meta-cognitive level may be brought about from the knowledge community in relation to Professor Yu's comment. Well, the knowledge community, in the knowledge community, how we can produce knowledge and how can knowledge be challenged? Such questions should be discussed. But the content of the controversial issues is not something to teach. Rather, we have to discuss the questions themselves. Well, social justice equity have been taught, and many people teach them. For example, we need this, we need that. But from the perspective of literacy educators, we cannot really give an answer. Rather, we have to share the approaches to such questions. A variety of perspectives and opinions should be shared through discourse and text. And we have to let our students communicate based on the approaches. And I think it's also critical to citizenship improvement, which was mentioned by Dr. Chang. Do I have time left? Do I have time? 1 minute? Okay. Well, Dr. Chang said that the students who were really good at analyzing photos. Was there any pre-activities? Yes, we did in the classroom, photo analysis activities, but they were not necessarily the top in the classroom. In the standardized evaluation, they are actually in around the mean of the academic scores, but they were really sharp in the photo analysis indeed. I don't think teachers' role is not something to give in terms of content. Rather, we should work as a facilitator or a guide. We cannot teach anything to students. We can have them do on their own. So we have to provide a sort of optimal environment where students can think on their own and do on their own. Teachers and students can work together and work on photo analysis together. We actually provide that condition for them to work together. But these students actually brought about their own background, assets. So how much we can drag the knowledge assets of each student. And that's called asset-based pedagogy, resource-based pedagogy. Everybody has their own resources or assets, and it would be great if they can make a full use of such assets that are already. As a teacher, we have to have this mind that my students can do something, my students can think in different ways, and how can I help my students do that? Rather than my students have no ideas and they are those who I have to teach, rather than such approaches. Now, Professor Mitsukoshi.
So the key questions raised. So in the question, she's summarizing the questions. So how about we have a goal of realizing the alternative, the infrastructure? In your project, it seemed like it was just imagined. And the project itself, it looks like it's trying to go beyond the current level of media literacy, but it seems to be only focused on critical thinking instead of going beyond the critical thinking to critical making. So critical media thinking and as entities and the subjects with the creative and the critical thinking, is there a good ways to do the projects and all the discussions in your project that there seems to be the many different people from the industry and the different areas. So is there anything that we should be careful when we're doing the project with different kinds of people?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you. I'm so happy to have a very keen and deep question from 3 persons. And I was so delighted. And I will use some pictures during the presentation I made it. I think it's all the 3 questions in my mind connected organizationally. So from the first, I will start to reply to Dr. Amie. And this is a very rough sketch of my understanding. And, you know, when I put the title Media Infrastructure Project in 2017 for the preparation, my thinking is a little bit vague. And I myself think we are now focusing on the media platform. And Hyeon-Seon knows very well that I am very much, trying to encourage local people, school teachers, universities, small-sized media to collaborate each other to make a media biotope. So I will explain a little bit. Media infrastructure, for example, highway, railroad, internet, radio wave, water supply, gas, cable, kind of thing. Do you remember that there are alternative to the internet, TCP, in Japan, which was called TCP, VI&P. That was invented in late 80s, but it was banned out by the American government. And the same kind of things emerged in the European country, but they are also not so developed, only stay as an experimental one. But when we look back to the history of the internet, there are many alternatives, another internet or another internet. But the US government trumpeted the superhighway or kind of things under the Bill Clinton government, and the internet became the standard, transparent, take for granted. In China, in Russia, in Korea, everyone used the internet, TCP/IP. But we never think about the alternative again. Only the artist, media artists like Professor O. Radio wave, also the same, highway, railroad. I have many things I can tell you. How to make the railroad in the colonial Korean by Japanese imperial government, that kind of thing make a very big political, cultural, social changing or kind of things. How about the city of Gwangju? It was made alongside a railroad, and that is not a very old town, but it's in some way very modern town. That's a very subtle and bad policy for Japanese government, colonial government, to put that kind of thing. So anyhow, the media infrastructure is under the consciousness. We use it, but we don't take care about that. But many of you remember that in mid-90s, there are many questionnaires that, do you use the internet in your household? Now, how about this kind of the question now, 2020? That's ridiculous. Nobody think, oh, I am using the KakaoTalk, but I don't use the internet or kind of things. So the it's a very relative matter, but infrastructure is around here. And media platform is, for the moment, I'm thinking KakaoTalk, Naver, Twitter, Netflix, or the Yahoo Japan, Google, GAFA, or something like that, a kind of the platform. And here is a media ecosystem, which is not only determined by the technology, but the culture, people, organization, economics. There are many actors. And the media ecosystem is not only a technologically determined one, but it's a kind of the amalgam among the social, cultural, and the technological things. So for example, here is a media ecosystem in Korea, in Japan, or in China also. And here is some unique name, media biotope. This is a title of my book in 2005, but I'm trying to make a kind of the ecosystem with school teacher, media centers people, university people, local people, cable stations, the kind of things, and connect each other to make a kind of relatively independent sphere for the community. This is a kind of the experiment, which is very much connected to Professor Cho's activities. And this media biotope is small things, but still, when we engage in this kind of things, we can critically understand the media ecosystem of the nation states or global matters. And also, sorry? So here is some tension between the media ecosystem. Sorry, okay. So media biotope and the media ecosystem has a kind of the tension. And when we make this kind of media biotope, we can go digging in to the media platform, or we can still tentatively but experimentally, experience the infrastructure or so on, because we have to manage this kind of the media biotope. So this kind of thing is a general, formation of the concept of my understanding. And I'm going to move to the Professor Yo's question that, yeah, it's very connected to this kind of things. I think for the larger meaning of learning or education, we need some concrete region or concrete sphere for which or by which we can learn each other. But this does not need to only be in Korea or in Incheon or so. And it must be connected to Japan, Australia, or other places. It must be hybrid. But so it's a the matter of balance. In these days, in Japan, the society is very nationalistic and domestic and close to the community, and Japan is beautiful kind of thing. I don't like that. So the only connecting to the community or regional area is sometimes very dangerous. But still, we need some critical making place or critical discussion place like this kind of thing. So this is Incheon's things. I felt today that in Incheon, you have a kind of the media biotope. And the other thing I want to show you is that, sorry, I'm taking time, I know, but this one. This is one of the achievements of the MEL project. In 2006, collaborating with Jeong and Sophia Wu in Taiwan, and Chin Sevin in Taiwan, and me and other Japanese professors, that we are, in 2007, we are trumpeting the media literacy must be hybrid or global or regional. It does not, it should not be in a nationalistic, situation. So we have to continue this kind of effort in the new stage of the media situation. And last question by Professor Lee, it's very keen, and I just want to show you something. This is a kind of the toolkit for the public. This is a kind of the digital toolkit for kids or general people, and this is operated by cooperative formation, and I am one of the member. So I usually use the Jitsi, Jitsi. It's a Swedish online conference system. Server is situated in Finland, and the energy is coming from the sunlight in the northern part of the Finland. And you know, there are this kind of activities gently but mildly, protesting to the GAFA-like situation. And also, maybe you know this well. Here is a DuckDuckGo. This is also the alternative to the Google. And in 2003-04, there are many alternatives to Google. Most people forgot about it. And Google is now shifting from the media platform to the media infrastructure. So yes, as Professor Lee said, I am maybe too much expanding the concept of the media, but at the same time, I believe that it's not only the expanding, but reflecting and trying to think about the alternative social shape of media by the workshop or by the history and by the kind of the media art-like activities. So thank you.
네, 답변 감사합니다. 저희 질문창에 좀 시간이 지연돼서 많은 청중분들께서 혹시 이거를 나중에 다른 플랫폼에서 공유해 주실 수 있는지 여러분께서 여쭤보셨는데 저희가 그거는 이 웨비나 말미에 좀 설명을 더 드리겠고요. 그리고 청중으로 등록하시기 위해서 다 이메일을 입력해 주셨던 걸로 알고 있는데 좀 이메일로 다시 한번 안내를 해드리도록 하겠습니다. 그러면 이제 다음으로 루시 팡그라지오 박사님의 답변으로 넘어가도록 하겠습니다. 크게 세 가지로 좀
Make sure that your email is with us. Then we will let you know the another platform where you will watch this video. Okay. So I would like to ask a question in digital literacy. Well, is there any specific way to make digital literacy education program be part of a social activities? I mean, well, the critical thinking is very important, but while we are emphasizing critical thinking, maybe the benefits of datafication has been missing or has been hidden. And last but not least, well, in systems and institutions, we may need an approach to give a guide to our teenagers. So the question to Ms. Lucy Pangrazio.
So thank you very much for the questions. And the way I sort of thought about those, some relate specifically to the project. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the more general questions around the kind of environment that we can create that will enable these kinds of critical education projects to get off the ground. So Dr. Amie Kim asked about the impact on the young people in the project, and we certainly did notice afterwards that there were some really positive kinds of impacts on the students and how they were thinking about the construction of their digital identities. There was certainly greater awareness of what should go on to a digital profile, and also they developed an understanding of what privacy settings are and how they can be used to kind of manage. Because what we find with young people is it's not always about, protecting your privacy at all costs. Obviously, you need to be visible to your peers. So being able to kind of negotiate those nuances was certainly something we could support them with. I also think one of the great benefits of a project like this was working collectively with young people so that they could really work with each other
and their teacher to talk about some of the problems and issues of social media, because what we tend to find is that and in my previous work, in my doctoral work, was that teenagers, young people, are often negotiating these challenges on their own, and they don't actually think about the fact that many other young people are also experiencing the same kind of concerns and tensions that they are. So that's a real kind of to come together and talk about these problems, to create a safe space to kind of share these issues, whether it's about personal data or digital literacies, you know, how to work particular platforms, appropriateness, that kind of stuff. It was really quite powerful. As to your question around teachers, how do we support teachers? It's a really good question, and something that I think we need further work on. Certainly my research has shown that. I think a good starting point is to really think about this as being a kind of developing a holistic kind of approach. And in some ways, this comes a question that was asked a bit later on by Woohyun around, do we all need to kind of, do adults, do older people need to kind of understand these challenges? And I think definitely yes, because once we develop a more of a community response to these challenges, teachers, adults can also support young people and make room for this as a priority in the curriculum, so that it's not just teachers trying to squeeze it in at the end of the term, but actually, you know, it's something that our young people need to understand and know about. And your first question, but I've actually gone in the opposite direction because it was quite a challenging question, is imagining okay, or how do we come up with an alternative? And I guess as a starting point, I think just opening up these digital platforms and sort of reverse engineering them with students to kind of show what is going on is really powerful. And once you have those openings, then perhaps the imagination can begin to grow, because you can think about, well, how could this be different? You know, why are our default settings always to this particular, you know, particular sort of setting? So I think there's something really powerful in kind of thinking through and deconstructing, and that then maybe there's a possibility for imagining an alternative. Again, I guess it's about a critical mass calling for those alternatives, and as Professor Shin pointed out, there are alternatives out there. It's also making those available and pointing them out to young people as well. Just the question around, are there any regulations by our governments in Australia for supporting young people and developing their kind of creating a safe space? Certainly, we do have a very robust cyber safety kind of discourse in Australia, and we've got some really excellent programs from, say, the E-Safety Commission in Victoria, where I am, and they're really beginning to develop. So they're not just about staying safe online, but how you can make the most of your digital experiences. So they're not simply, you know, about protecting yourself at all costs, but how can you use this in a very agentic way? And I think that in many ways is the key question for me as a researcher in this space, is how you kind of navigate the kind of protectionist discourse of cyber safety, but then, you know, really support young people to develop those agentic practices that mean they can think critically, they can, you know, reverse engineer or think about doing things differently, or even perhaps creatively using data. That's the real kind of tension. And I don't think it has to be an either or. I think we can do both, but perhaps there needs to be kind of more of a continuation of digital learning, if you like. So cyber safety, and then moving on into these kinds of more critical and creative practices that we might see. We do have other forms of data regulation around. We've got a, you know, Privacy Act, and of course in Europe there's the GDPR. So from a kind of creating a safe space in that legal sense, there are some regulations in place, but I guess this was a question to somebody else, but it really got me thinking around what might a critically digital literate person look like? I think it's an excellent question for us to think about. What is that ideal person that we have in mind? And I think, you know, regardless of all the wonderful kinds of things that we can do with young people in the programs and the designing and critique, we really need a very solid legal framework in order to support people's privacy and enable them to have choice around what they do in the digital space. So I might leave it there because that's probably gone over time.
네, 좀 시간 관계로 오창근 교수님의 답변으로
네.
넘어가도록 하겠습니다.
Due to the
저희
time
마지막
constraints, I will hand over to Professor Oh. He is the last presenter to give the response. The question was threefold. First is the practical question. So how we can integrate the digital arts creation into the classroom activities. And second, through digital art interaction, so can students really develop the critical thinking skills? And the third question is related with the second question. And as a viewers and as a performers and observers, yes, you show the video of the viewers interacting with the work. But even going beyond that, we might be able to encourage people to become the producers and go even beyond merely experiencing and interacting with the artwork. Yes, I'm the last presenter to give the response. So I think you probably all watching the time, so I will be really brief. But I've given a lot of questions. So yes, I will try to give the response to all the questions in my brief response. Yes, for teachers, that how we can integrate that what we do in classroom activities. So the students of the University of Education, they are participating as the volunteers and they get the training to be docent, and they can also participate in the workshop that are done by the artists. And the students, after a few years, they became teachers at the elementary school. So they can come back to this exhibition space together with the elementary school students and do the education for the elementary school students that they're teaching. So this is the circle that we have already created. And whether that can really be practical, yes, we have to see. But already in the textbook for arts in elementary school, that the media arts and the digital arts are already part of the textbook. So the elementary school student, they know theoretically what digital art is, and they can experience the digital arts. And this is the response to Dr. Chang's question. The first question was about the barrier. Is it the low barrier or the high barrier? So developing the digital art, I believe it's easier than creating a game, but there's one precondition. Students, they should have an understanding of art or media activity. So students, when they clap or the shout, that the artwork, that they can become break into the pieces and disappears. And making the digital artwork like this is quite simple, not really difficult. So at the National Museum of Contemporary Art, yes, I've already done developing the artworks for the children like this, and we've already encouraged the elementary school students to create the artworks like this, and yes, they can do that. So the barrier is quite low. And the second question, was about the collaboration between the Gyeongin National University of Education and Incheon Community Media Center. Yes, there were some difficulties. The public institution, both are public institutions. One is a university and one is a media center. And linked to P2P is the artwork that I've shown in the presentation. And after being exhibited at the university, it was now exhibited at the Incheon Community Media Center. Since it's a public institution, that there was some concerns about the price that we have to pay for exhibiting the artwork, because there was no regulations on this kind of a digital artwork renting and the paying for the labor involved in it. So yes, collaboration itself is not difficult, but there were some limitations as there is no guidelines or the regulations in place. And as mentioned by Professor Shin Mitsukoshi, the media biotope, and I hope that we can build a media biotope so that all the different entities can collaborate better and share the resources better. And the Professor Yu asked this question. So to make the media, the artwork experience into a systematic classroom activities, yes, the coding is already part of the education at elementary school, and there are 3D printers and other devices available for students. But rather than simply letting the students use the devices, we should encourage them to create the digital arts. So what we need is the programs that encourage the students to do that. For now, yes, there is no official program. So if we can develop the programs like this, I believe that it can be fully integrated as a part of the curriculum. And yes, the STEM education could be part of the solution. Teachers themselves cannot prepare all the things, so those with the expertise and experience should collaborate to create a program like this to provide to the students. And lastly, the Professor E asked the question. That question itself is quite difficult and tough. Yes, the production aesthetics, that is somewhat related with the concept raised by the Professor Jin Jung-kwon. So the pleasure in creating the artwork, yes, it's already felt by children when they draw something and when they fold something with the paper. And you might think that that has a more depth, but the artists, when they create something, yeah, it's the same experience whether the children create something or the artist creates something. Through the education of coding, the students can create the game and take pleasure in it, and digital artists can take the same pleasure in creating the works. So when these artists create the digital artwork that is quite unique, then of course they can take the pleasure. And lastly, the experience and the appreciation of the artworks that you mentioned in your discussion, and I particularly remember the two viewers. And the first one, it was the curator for my work. So my work was exhibited for 2 weeks, and this curator was there and came to work 1 hour early every morning. And for 1 hour, this curator stood in front of my artwork to experience the work. And I asked, why did you do that? Because the curator responded that it felt like this work is like a mirror. So I wanted to come early and to see it for the 1 hour. And there was another viewer, and it was a young girl, and probably the elementary school student. And this young girl, at my last personal exhibition, came to see my artwork, and she was well dressed and well groomed. And in 2 hours, when she ran out of the gallery, her hair was all messed up and her clothes were all messed up because for 2 years, she was acting and making the movements, interacting actively with the artwork. Thankfully, there was no one around her, so she was able to occupy the artwork all by herself. So by looking at the 2 cases, that I was able to see the true pleasure that this interaction gives to the viewers. And that I believe is the part of the digital and critical, the literacy. And they can take this literacy to themselves and they can think critically about their experience. They can become the main player and the protagonist in that experience. So the viewers, when they end, they can continue to experience and have the freedom to experience. So through the digital art and through the interactive art, I believe the strength is in that, the making the viewers into the protagonist and into the active performer. Thank you.
네, 이상으로 5분이
Thank you.
토론자와 5분의
So,
발표자로부터 모든 답변을 들었습니다.
we received some comments and answers some questions from 5 discussants and 5 presenters in a relatively short period of time. We thought that time would be short, but still we couldn't really stop people talking about questions and comments because we have a plan to use the content of your discussions in the article of a journal. So if you think that your answer was not enough, maybe you can still continue to speak about the comments that you made today in the article. And we actually received a lot of questions, so we may share them with you later. And all the videos will be available on YouTube later, and the host organization will give you more specific announcements about it. And Professor Lee actually mentions too, which actually encompassed 2 big pictures of today's webinar. One is what would be the methodologies that we can accomplish digital literacy and digital at the age of digital platform. We can imagine the subject of digital literacy, and we also have to seek the digital literacy imagination. Thank you very much for this for participating in this lengthy conference, discussants and presenters. They have been working all together by checking the connections almost for 24 hours, throughout yesterday and today. Thank you very much. Last but not least, I also would like to pass over the microphone to Professor Hyeon-Seon, the Director of Gyeongin University of Education, Institute for Education and Research. Well, we had a plan to finish this by 5 o'clock, but we are 1 hour delayed. We didn't stop it because we had really ample discussions and very productive content. We have been setting up this conference for the last few months. Thank you very much for being here with us until now out of this your busy schedule right under this COVID-19 situation. We have seen very wonderful discussions and presentations. Presenters, discussants, thank you very much. And our interpreters who have been providing language services for English and Korean. Thank you, wonderful interpreters. And the world-class technical supporter, Caspia, and also those who have been working on administrations and other housekeeping matters. at the Gyeongin National University of Education and Incheon Community Media Center. Thank you very much. We have been shared many stories and ideas, and such stories and narrators were all well summed up in the discussion session. As a planner of this conference, I thought of this. I thought that critical media literacy and digital literacy have been emerging as hot topics at this age. And the global scholarship and network and communications are all important in the age of digital literacy and critical digital literacy. In this changing world, we have to transform our recognition and perception. We also have to have some new competence. And we also have to understand the reality faced by ourselves. So we need a sort of ground, and for which we have to conduct research. We have seen fake news recently, but I don't think fact check itself can provide all answers or answers for all questions like false or true. We cannot really divide something into two. So our role, the role of researchers, are very important. And as mentioned in the presentations, Digital Y in Europe and also the Australia have the network of researchers, and Global Kids Zone is also another network of researchers. And Professor Shin Michikoshi also said that in the Asian region, he has been working to create a network of researchers within Asia. And Dr. Oh and I had a chance to fly to Tokyo, but they couldn't because of the COVID-19. But I promise that I'll fly into Tokyo later. And at the end of last year, we started planning the conference. That time, we thought of course, offline conference where we can see you in person. And going through COVID-19 situations, we had an expectations that we could invite people online alone, particularly overseas participants can visit us online. And also, but we thought that we could have some participants from Korea, though, in person. But now it's almost 100% virtual conference, so it's a pity. But still, within this limitation, we have been quite successful, I would say. There should be some other stories, some more ideas that we wish we could have shared, but we will continue to discuss and converse and network out together, so we will have more chances to talk about this. Once COVID-19 situation is over, and if we have a chance to be free to go abroad, then let's keep talking about the issues that we are concerned about. And also let's seek the common goals and direction in the directions that we created together. Media 비협업 will be possible with the starting point of today's webinar, I hope. Digital literacy, whether it be content or infrastructure, is based on continuous dialogue and the opportunities of different imaginations. That's the lessons that we learned from today's webinar. Once again, thank you all participants, presenters, and discussants. Today's webinar will be available on YouTube in 2 languages, Korean and English, a week later. Please share your ideas and words with us about today's webinar. Maybe you can leave your message on the question window so that we will reflect your reviews and we will make even better webinar or conferences next time. Digital platform age, rethinking literacy through contemporary media education. The webinar is now over. Let's overcome these difficult times. Thank you very much.
수고하셨습니다.
Thank you.